3 weeks before Thanksgiving, my mother called to tell me I wasn't invited. She didn't say it like it was a difficult decision. She said it like she was informing me of a change in the guest list, an update to be absorbed and filed away. The phone buzzed on my kitchen counter while pancakes were burning in the skillet. I remember the way her voice slid into the receiver. Calm, practiced, the same voice that set curfews and baked cinnamon rolls on Sundays. "Sophia doesn't want you there this year," she said. "Marcus will be with us, and you know how that is." For a second, I thought it was a joke. My sister, Sophia, was the sort who turned small things into theater and then expected applause. Marcus Stone, was the kind of man whose presence made restaurant managers straighten their aprons. He donated to museums, sat on panels, got photographed in front of art installations with a practiced half-smile. People liked being seen with him. My parents had been proud, and that pride had matched the tape of new frames on their walls. "I can come in the afternoon," I said, because that's what people say when they don't want to shut a door but don't know where to put the key. "I can bring the pie." There was a pause on the line, a sound like a small door closing in another room. "It would be better if you didn't," my mother said. "Sophia feels—" She stopped and swallowed something I couldn't hear. "She feels awkward." I could tell it wasn't my mother who felt awkward. It was permission for an embarrassment to be avoided. I taught 5-year-olds how to wait their turn, how to share crayons, how to name colors. I taught small, steady things that mattered a lot. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment that smelled like chalk dust and lemon-scented cleaner. My couch had a hole in one cushion where I sometimes fell asleep grading worksheets. I wore hand-me-down coats and a Target dress to my sister's graduation party, because a dress is a dress until someone stares. Everyone in my life knew these things about me. To most of my students, I was Ms. Torres. To my sister, I was apparently a detail she could tidy up like a misplaced coaster. When she forwarded me the group photo later that week, the table arranged like a magazine spread, Marcus at the head, my parents shining beside him, people commented and liked and left little heart emojis. Sophia captioned it, "Family Matters." Grateful. Beneath the glitter and hashtags, my missing plate hung like a blank space in a portrait. My first instinct was to apologize. I stared at my phone and typed, then erased. Apologies have a way of turning the aggressor into the offended and the offended into the forgiver. I thought instead about Grandma Eleanor. People in our family used to say Eleanor didn't like fuss. She lived the way she gave, quietly, without banners, without Instagram posts. She kept a box of salted caramels in her kitchen drawer and a notebook full of names, teachers, neighbors, people who needed a winter coat. She had been a 3rd-grade teacher once, too, and she remembered the sound of small shoes treading into her classroom like a hymn. When she died, the funeral was middling. Flowers, church, polite nods. She left notes instead of speeches. After the funeral, while everyone else was rearranging casseroles, I found a key tucked in a folded handkerchief in her Bible. It was stamped with a tiny, crooked E. Nobody else seemed to notice that she had left me a key. Maybe they assumed it was a trinket. Maybe they were busy counting the ways her life made their stories look better. Grandma had a safe deposit box at a little bank downtown beneath the red light of the intersection. It smelled faintly of old paper and metal. In the box, I found a folder that was thicker than I expected, tied with a twine bow. Inside was a will, among other things, a legal folder with handwriting that looped kindly and a line that made my chest tighten. For Isabella Torres, with the faith that she will choose compassion even when no one is looking. It was not a check, not a flashy certificate. It was a set of instructions, and a body of work left to be stewarded. There was a foundation, small to start with and then quietly grown. 3 properties, money set aside. $15 million in assets, the papers said, though Grandma had never told anyone about it. It wasn't that she wanted to make us rich. It felt like she wanted to test us. The will had clauses that read like a lesson plan. A stipulation that those who managed the fund must never discriminate. A line about humility, and a clause that people who caused willful harm and public shaming could forfeit any claim. Section 7.3 said, in plain handwriting, that the Foundation's assets must be used for the dignity and support of teachers and essential workers, and that any beneficiary or board member who engages in exclusionary conduct designed to humiliate or prejudice another person would lose standing. There were witnesses' signatures, neighbors, a former colleague, and a sealed recording, described as to be opened only upon the executor's direction. James Whitman, the lawyer who had filed the paperwork, was named executor. The papers were stamped, dated, and most importantly, they were real. I didn't tell anyone about the folder at first. Grandma had raised me to keep the trust of fragile things. She had given me, in the small of mornings and the hush of late nights, lessons that stuck. Be invisible when your work needs to be invisible. Measure the worth of a person by how they treat those who can't pay them back. I had her voice in my ear when Sophia posted the picture. I had her handwriting in my hands. There was a temptation to wield the papers like a weapon. That would be easier in some ways. Sit back while the family untangled itself in public, and then, like a deus ex machina, pull the cord and reveal the truth. But my grandmother had not been interested in the spectacle. She had been interested in character. Her will wasn't a trap, it was a measurement. She wanted to see who we were when nobody was applauding. So I watched. I watched texts slide across screens with the same dispassionate attention I gave to a classroom that refuses to settle. Isabella is so awkward, Sophia wrote to a friend. She'll make it uncomfortable for Marcus. A screenshot. A laugh. My parents, when visiting, began to avoid saying my name. At family gatherings, they set another plate at the end of the table, as if ignorance could be mistaken for hospitality. I could have been louder. I could have called Sophia out in a public post, given the cameras something to chew. But every time I thought of doing that, I pictured Grandma's face. Skeptical, amused, waiting like a teacher with a hand behind her back. Her mission was not to embarrass, it was to define the moral test. So I kept quiet. Silence isn't always cowardice. Sometimes it's the way you let truth swell until it can't be contained. I gave my quiet time to gathering evidence, not to doom someone, but to show what had already happened. There were screenshots and texts and small recorded messages where people said things they might later regret. There were dated emails and a parking pass stub showing where Sophia had met a friend who had a long history of making pointed jokes about people like Isabella. It wasn't glamorous. It was paper and pixels and the slow accumulation of a pattern. When I did finally tell someone about the folder, I told James Whitman. He was methodical and unshowy. Gray suit that fit like a second skin, the kind of man who had spent years translating people's intentions into legal language. He handled wills for people who wanted to make sure their details were respected. When I sat across from him in his small office and slid Grandma's folder across his desk, he put on reading glasses and let the seconds pass like a teacher letting a class think. "This is well documented," he said, thumbs brushing the edges of the papers. "She did not leave this to be wasted." "You can call the meeting without telling the family what's in there?" I asked. He nodded. "We can call the board. We can verify the witnesses. The recording can be authenticated. If there's a clause that the executor is to reveal things under certain circumstances, we'll follow that protocol." When I walked out of his office, the fall light caught the city in a way that made everything look like a postcard. I felt like I was holding a candle in a wind tunnel, frightened it would blow out, but knowing that sometimes light finds its way. Part of me wanted to reconcile without fanfare. I wanted to stand at my mother's kitchen and say, "You don't have to be ashamed of me." I wanted to be the one to bring the pie and sit quietly and watch conversation happen. But there is a common trick that people do with grief and pride. They confuse reconciliation with erasure. If my being at that table required me to shrink, to pretend the past wasn't there, then it wasn't reconciliation. It was complicity. So I chose another path. I told James we would call a board meeting, and I told no one else. In the weeks after the uninvitation, our family conversations became like potluck dinners where no one wanted to commit to bringing a dish. My parents oscillated between stiff politeness and sudden bouts of nostalgia. At dinner, they would show me old photos. Their eyes would gloss over the frames where Sophia was a child with a ribbon in her hair, and the way they looked at those pictures made clear which child had been the household's standard bearer. "Don't be dramatic," my mother told me once when I showed up with a casserole and no invitation. She stood on the threshold like a guardian of propriety. "Sophia has sensitive feelings. Marcus feels awkward. We think it's best for everyone." In the privacy of my small living room, with a mug that always had a chip on the rim, I tried to name what hurt. It wasn't the hole at the table. It was the implication that I was a liability. That a kindergarten teacher, someone who tied shoes and kissed scraped knees, would somehow reflect poorly on people who measure themselves by the size of their donations and the number of times their name appears in the society pages. I thought about dignity. I thought about how it isn't something you wear only when someone takes your picture. Dignity is what you give yourself when no one applauds, and what you demand for others when they can't demand it for themselves. There were other tests. Sophia ramped up her social posts into what felt like a campaign. There were glossy pictures of extravagant dinners, hashtags about honor family first and grateful life. But at the edges of those photos, there was the steady, quiet life I knew. Me, stacking alphabet cards into neat piles, teaching a kid named Mateo to say his L's. It felt absurd to compare the two, my life against Sophia's. But that's how families do geometry. They fold conscience into shapes that fit. I didn't have the kind of money that made people stop mid-sentence to listen. I had lesson plans and a small class of children who loved to put stickers on the good work. I had a wardrobe full of practical things and a personality that didn't like making a fuss. But when I read Grandma's words, "Choose compassion even when no one is looking," I felt as if the trust she'd placed in me needed someone steady to hold it. There was also fear, not for myself. I had learned to live modestly and quietly. The fear was that I was about to pull a cord that would unspool more of our family than I'd guessed. People are elastic in different directions. Pull on one end and the knot tightens on another. I knew that exposing the truth could hurt people, my parents, who had always wanted to seem respectable in polite company, Sophia, who had worked hard to craft an image that would pay dividends, Marcus, whose social associations were part of his brand. I weighed that against what Grandma would have wanted: truth, accountability, and the use of resources for public good. After a week of watching and keeping a small ledger of private evidences, James called and told me we had the board's provisional support. He said the witnesses verified their signatures. He said the recording in the sealed envelope could be authenticated and that under the terms the foundation's assets could be transferred if certain conditions applied. He said there would be a gala presentation, formalities that would make the transition clear to donors and the public. A gala felt absurd to me. My idea of celebration was pizza with the after-school art teachers and a ribbon cutting for a classroom garden. But I learned quickly that the world of philanthropy likes its own theatricality. A gala would give us a stage big enough that the truth would be visible, that donors could see where their gifts were going, that the board could affirm its decisions under light and witnesses. "Sounds like something out of a movie," my sister said when I told her there would be a foundation meeting. She was on speakerphone and I could hear the clink of glassware in the background. "Are you going to wear that Target dress?" she asked, half laughing. I said nothing at first. The Target dress had a seam where the fabric wanted to be better than it was. It fit because I had learned how to make things work. "Maybe," I said finally. "Maybe it's time for something presentable." Sophia made a noise that could have been amusement or pity. "Just don't embarrass us," she said. "We have guests." There it was again, the equation of me with embarrassment. I remember standing at my sink afterward, hands in soapy water, feeling the smallness of the apartment and the vastness of what Grandma had entrusted to me. Somehow, in the quiet steam of dishes, the scale of the choice spread and became heavier. The board insisted on timing. There would be a public dinner to announce the foundation's future projects. We would present programs that directed resources to teachers and to emergency childcare for essential workers. James wanted the public reveal because the will's clauses had to be enforced transparently. The sealed recording, Grandma's voice, would be played for the assembled guests and recorded. It would be dated and authenticated. Witnesses would be asked to confirm. If the board found that Sophia's actions violated the clause, the forfeiture could be invoked. I realized, with an odd mix of dread and relief, that my silence had been a kind of mercy. It allowed the facts to accumulate. It allowed the people involved to show themselves. It allowed me not to improvise accusation, but to let evidence speak in a room full of witnesses. My sister, true to her nature, tried to short-circuit the process. 2 weeks before the gala, she started a more aggressive campaign. Social media posts that painted herself as the wounded sibling, interviews with people who called her a dedicated professional, and private messages to donors implying that I was trying to hijack the family's legacy. She called my parents and leaned on every lever she could. My mother cried on the phone in a way that sounded like a small storm. My father tried to reason with me like we were discussing a tax form. They came to my apartment one evening, both of them together, breaking the boundary I had learned to keep in the same way teachers do when they step into a student's bedroom to search for a missing book. They stood in my living room like two people who had practiced neutrality and then forgotten how. There was a smell of the perfume my mother always wore, something floral and aggressively pleasant, and a look in my father's eyes that tried to be neutral and folded into panic. "You have to step down," my mother said. "You have to sign something that tells James you won't pursue this, for the sake of the family." "What is the family to you?" my father asked. "If it's built like this?" They didn't have to finish the sentence. The shape of it was clear. If I insisted, they'd be embarrassed in public. They would have to explain that their daughter, my sister, had been accused of humiliating her sibling. They would be seen as having raised a family that could behave in such a way. I felt the thinness of their defense against shame. "I can't sign anything that isn't true," I said. My voice was low in the apartment, like a bell you ring when the children are napping. "I won't lie for the appearance of peace." They looked like they had been struck by something unexpected. My father set his hands on the arm of my couch, like a man trying to steady himself. "You're making this harder," he said, "for everyone." And in some ways I was. The life of families is structured around compromises. I had been taught to value peace over pride, and in the past I had given peace its due. But this was not a request for peace. It was an attempt to paper over cruelty with the glossy sheen of respectability. When they left, my mother kissed my cheek like she used to when I was small, soft and a touch too long. I folded the memory of that kiss into the stack of other things I couldn't change. I did not tell them, at that moment, that the sealed envelope in Grandma's folder contained a recording where Eleanor had spoken directly about the test she had set up. I didn't tell them the words she had used to define dignity. Instead, I wrote a list. I am the kind of person who makes lists. Names of witnesses, dates, screenshots, phone call logs. It felt less like vengeance to do that and more like stewardship. I called James and told him to confirm the witnesses. He told me he would convene the board and that we would plan the gala in a way that was straightforward and, as he kept reminding me, unassailable. There was another side of this I didn't want to admit. The fear that the spectacle might hurt people I loved. Public humiliation is heavy and not easily contained. I told James that whatever we did, it should be principled and not performative. If the clause applied, the funds should be used as Eleanor intended. Teachers, essential workers, dignity preserved. There should be offers of redemption, volunteer positions for those willing to make amends, therapy offered to family members who needed it. The will had been explicit on that point. Redemption was a possibility, not a forfeiture without a path back. The more I thought about it, the more I understood that this was exactly where Grandma had wanted me to be. In the tension between family and duty, choosing responsibility for the greater good. I started preparing in small domestic ways. I mended the Target dress so it would sit straighter. I practiced a short talk in front of the mirror where my face looked like a tired photograph. I made a spreadsheet for program priorities, a small garden of numbers and ideas, grants for classroom supplies, emergency housing stipends for teachers who needed it, a program to refurbish daycares in neighborhoods that had been overlooked. Practical things. Things that might have made my grandmother nod and say, "Good." There were nights I slept badly, thinking about the moment the sealed recording would be played in a room full of people who had invested not only money, but identity into a certain narrative. Would they pivot to the reality of helping teachers? Would they be able to shift their social stories into social responsibility? I didn't know. People are stubborn in the stories they tell of themselves. During the quiet hours, I also kept thinking of Sophia, not as a public target, but as a person who had been loved and who had made choices. I remembered her as a child, running down our street with a ribbon in her hair, laughing in a way that made the day seem brighter. She had been my sister long before she was anyone else's headline. There was a part of me that held out for her capacity to change, for the simple human possibility that people could be corrected and come back better. The weeks drew closer to the gala with the steady inevitability of a school bell. James and the board confirmed the venue, donors were notified, press inquiries started to come through the foundation's email like rain on a tin roof. I taught my classes, kissed scraped knees, and filed lesson plans between conversations about legal verification. My life was an odd split screen, the small, important tasks of children learning to tie their shoes and the large public choosing of futures for thousands of people. Then, 72 hours before the gala, Sophia's posts shifted tone. She started to suggest that I was using Grandma's name for personal gain. She shared grainy screenshots of private messages where she claimed I was threatening her. Her supporters chimed in, old classmates, business associates, turning defense into chorus. As the volume rose, so did the danger that the public would see the story only as sibling drama and not as a test of stewardship. I sat on my couch that night with the folder in my lap, the papers warm from the light of the lamp. I thought of all the teachers in my classroom who scraped together money for art supplies, the single father who worked nights to keep his child in after-school care, the elderly aide who came weekly to help with a child with special needs. The funds in Grandma's foundation could do something real. They could buy materials, pay stipends, create stability in lives that made the city run. I called James and told him to make sure the witnesses would attend. Authenticate anything that needs authenticating, I said. We bring everything forward in a way that can't be simply waved away. He replied with the kind of legal calm that had steadied my own nervousness since the folder first reached his desk. We'll be meticulous, he said. We will make sure the recordings are time-stamped. The board will vote publicly. If the clause applies, the direction is clear. When I hung up, the noise from the city sounded like faraway applause. I put the folder back into the safe deposit box and slid the key into my pocket like a talisman. There was comfort in the weight of the metal. 2 days before the gala, my parents called. They sounded smaller than they had a month before. My mother asked about the pie again. My father tried to be reasonable, but his words tripped over one another. We don't want a scene, he said. We don't want public shame. You already have preferences, I told him. You have boundaries that exclude me. He was quiet for a long time. We were trying to keep peace, he said finally. Isabella, you have to understand. I understand, I replied. I also understand the difference between keeping peace and hiding cruelty. When someone says the word cruelty about your family, there is an immediate recoil, like a hand drawn back. They don't like to be described that way, even if the description fits. My parents' faces, when I saw them the following weekend, were maps of regret and stubbornness. They tried to speak to me about forgiveness, about not making situations worse. I said that forgiveness without accountability is a story we use to cover what we are afraid to fix. Are you going to ambush us at the gala? My mother asked, voice wavering like a child's on the verge of tantrum. If this is a performance, don't make it a show. I didn't start this as a performance, I said. Grandma started this as a test of character. I intend to follow the instructions she left. My mother looked at me like she was trying to find a way into the version of me who might bend. The idea that I would hold to a principle rather than smooth things over was outside the elasticity they had rehearsed for years. On the morning of the gala, there were 100 little logisticals, a rack of dresses to be steamed, a board meeting where people would sign off on the agenda, a press kit to prepare. The foundation's team was impeccably organized. Mrs. Stone, Marcus's mother and a member of the board, sent polite emails that read like small icebergs, polished, measured, and underpinned by some current of self-interest. Dr. Williams and Ms. Rodriguez agreed to be present. Judge Reynolds, the person whose career had been built in half-light and careful decisions, offered to deliver a statement on the importance of impartial stewardship. I went to the classroom that day because children, unlike adults, do not let the climate of your life invade their questions. They wanted to know about turkeys and if we would have glitter today. I kept the conversation light, my hands steady as I cut paper feathers and glued them with the patience of someone who believes in small things. Mateo, with tape on his fingers, looked up and said, Ms. Torres, will you still teach if you get rich? I smiled. I will still teach, I said. Some things you don't trade for money. He nodded seriously, as if the moral architecture of the universe was an element he could measure with a ruler. After school, I walked the block to my apartment, the afternoon sun making the windows of the brownstones wink. People were setting up tables downtown. Lights were being strung like necklaces. Somewhere in the city, guests were choosing shoes. At home, I laid the Target dress on my bed. I mended a seam with a careful stitch, like a teacher repairing a torn page. The dress didn't need to be new. It needed to fit the person I intended to be that night. Honest, composed, humane. There was no desire in me for spectacle. If anything, I wanted the evening to be so plainly about Eleanor's wishes that the individual drama would dissolve into the larger purpose. James called to tell me the witnesses had confirmed. "We will play the recording at the start of the presentation," he said. "We will have the board vote. Everything will be recorded and time-stamped. If the clause applies, the board will follow the will." "Do you think they will understand?" I asked. "People understand when facts are presented," he said. His voice was steady in the way I had learned to be. "We make sure the facts are clear." There were only 72 hours left when I sat on the edge of my bed and let myself feel the small tremor at the base of my ribs. The family drama had been punctured by something larger now. It was no longer about a seat at a table. It was about stewardship of resources, about whether privilege could be used to hide cruelty, and about whether the people entrusted with a gift would honor its purpose. Outside, the city breathed like a thing that couldn't decide whether to be storm or sun. Inside, the papers were folded into their keep. I checked the folder one more time, smoothing the creases with a teacher's insistence. This wasn't about winning or wounding. It was about handing down what Grandma intended and, if possible, about handing back an opportunity for my family to make amends. I knew the cameras would come. I knew the gala would glitter. I knew Sophia would be waiting, in whatever dignity she could summon, perhaps to pronounce me a usurper. But as I buttoned the target dress and felt my hands steady with a slow kind of resolve, I thought of the children who had made me better at being patient, the neighbors who had left notes in Eleanor's notebook, and the small, steady work of doing right. 72 hours before the curtain rose, I went to bed with the folder on my nightstand and Eleanor's handwriting in my head. The test she had laid out, choose compassion even when no one is watching, felt less like a burden and more like a call. I would go to that gala not to humiliate, but to make the truth visible. If that truth forced my family to reckon, then perhaps accountability could give them a path back instead of a cliff. In the quiet just before I fell asleep, I whispered a promise I hadn't meant to speak aloud. I would use whatever came of this to lift up teachers, to make sure classrooms had materials, and to honor Eleanor's vision. I didn't know how the night would end. I only knew that I wasn't willing to be embarrassed into silence. The night of the gala felt like stepping into someone else's photograph. Silver light pooled from chandeliers. The room smelled like jasmine and expensive anticipation. Waiters moved in rehearsed silence, clinking glasses like punctuation. People wore faces they had practiced in mirrors for years, polished, prepared, ready to be photographed beside each other. I smoothed the seam I had mended in my target dress and watched myself in the mirror until I recognized the person looking back, tired, steady, honest. If this resonates with you, if you've ever been left out of a family gathering or felt the sting of being treated like an inconvenience, please like and subscribe. I promise to keep telling stories like this. The board had asked that we arrive early. The green room was a small space with a couch that had seen happier committees and a mirror with lights that made our faces look important. Mrs. Stone adjusted her shawl and smiled in that curated way leaders learn to smile when cameras could be nearby. Dr. Williams made quiet conversation with Judge Reynolds about precedent in estate transitions, which felt surreal to me, the language of caution in a room meant for celebration. Sophia arrived late, the way someone arrives when a script has been rehearsed and the moment is imminent. Her hair was pulled back. There was a sheen of carefully applied composure. Marcus was at her side, his expression somewhere between defensive and annoyed, like a man who kept score by who would notice him. They moved through the crowd with the unspoken assumption that party optics could solve most problems. The guests took their seats. There were donors, people who had given quietly to good causes, and now found themselves sitting under the same light as a family whose private life had become public. There were local educators, some of them unknown to the social pages but deeply known to me. Municipal librarians, a school custodian who'd fixed a leaky roof for a whole semester, a preschool director with 2 jobs. Seeing them there, people who held neighborhoods together quietly, felt like a tether to the reason I had agreed to this spectacle. James Whitman stood and asked for attention. He wore the same methodical calm he'd always had, the gravel of someone who had learned to read people's intentions without melodrama. He spoke plainly about the Foundation's history, about Eleanor's quiet stewardship, and about the legal framework she'd left. Then he said what I'd already known in my bones. The sealed recording would be played. Witnesses would be called. The board would then vote publicly on whether Clause 7.3 applied. There was a hush like the one that falls over a classroom when a teacher sets down a book. My hands were warm where they rested on the podium I hadn't thought I'd use publicly. On the table beside James lay the sealed packet, Grandma Eleanor's recording in a tamper-evident envelope with a legal stamp across the flap. When he broke that seam, the room seemed to exhale and hold its breath. Eleanor's voice came out of the speakers like a memory finding a room. It was softer than I had imagined, but the words were clear, carefully phrased the way she always was when she wanted to teach. She spoke of dignity. She spoke of teachers and essential workers and of the tests she had laid out in her will, that the stewardship of the foundation must be guided by compassion, by a refusal to demean another for social appearance, and that those who engaged in public humiliation as a means of exclusion would forfeit claims to the foundation's leadership and benefits. She described, in her plain, direct way, a posture she hoped her family would take when no one was applauding. The recording was short. It wasn't theatrical. It was an old woman talking about what mattered to her. But the weight of it landed the way a stone drops into still water, ripples spreading outward. Then James read the relevant text out loud. I watched people watch their plates. The paragraph included the reference, Section 7.3, Non-Discrimination and Forfeiture Clause, with witnesses' signatures attesting to its wording. He explained, in language stripped of jargon, how the clause could be applied. If a beneficiary or board member had engaged in exclusionary conduct designed to humiliate or prejudice another person, the board could, by vote, revoke standing and redirect assets as the will stipulated. Then came the part where evidence speaks louder than accusation. James presented the documentation, time-stamped screenshots, dated messages, and witness statements. The room watched a discrete projection, nothing flashy, just clear images and dates, showing the pattern of exclusion. The messages where Sophia had called me awkward, the private messages where she strategized about keeping things comfortable by excluding me, the public posts that spun a different tale. The witnesses included neighbors and a former colleague who had signed the will attesting they'd heard Eleanor express the test. They stepped up and confirmed, under oath in that moment and with legal formalities, that the recording and documents were authentic. Sophia's face changed when the evidence filled the room. For a second, she looked like who she had once been, a child startled by a teacher's reprimand. Then she tried to smile, an attempt to make the crowd side with her. She made a quick statement, calculated, breathy, about being misunderstood, about family tensions, about how social media had inflated private hurts. Marcus stood beside her and briefly offered a thin defense. We're all human, he said. There were murmurs of sympathy from some corners, but the facts were laid bare. The posture of exclusion, the calculated avoidance, the public performance of gratitude while privately scripting humiliation. James then opened the floor for the board vote. The procedure was unglamorous and exact. The board members, Judge Reynolds, Dr. Williams, Ms. Rodriguez, Mrs. Stone, each had their moment to speak. They asked the clarifying questions James suggested, and they weighed what eminent Eleanor had set as the foundation's North Star: dignity for teachers and essential workers. The board voted, publicly and on the record. Unanimously, they found that Clause 7.3 applied. When James announced the board's decision, an invocation of the forfeiture clause that would prevent Sophia from claiming leadership or financial entitlement tied to the assets, the room did not explode into applause. Many people were simply quiet, processing the mechanics of how a will can, in some hands, be a moral compass. There was a low hum of conversation, the mechanical sound of reality rearranging itself. Sophia wept then, quietly and fiercely. It wasn't the melodramatic collapse I had feared. It was a person whose story, carefully curated, had unspooled in public. She said things that were sharp and hurtful toward me, words that stung because they were partial and self-protective. Marcus looked lost. For a moment, the evening could have become a tableau of punishment. I felt the familiar pull, an itch to say things sharp enough to make a point. But the part of me Grandma taught to measure people by how they treated those without applause held me steady. I walked up to the microphone not to strike, but to mend. I spoke plainly about my grandmother's life, about teachers and dignity, and what the foundation would now focus on. I explained in practical terms how the assets, $15 million, and the 3 properties Eleanor had quietly accumulated would be directed toward grants for classroom supplies, stipends for underpaid educators, emergency housing support for school employees in crisis, and the refurbishment of childcare centers in neighborhoods that had been overlooked. I also addressed my family directly. I said, without theatrics, that the clause in the will wasn't meant to punish but to redirect. It existed to preserve Eleanor's values. I offered what Eleanor herself would have offered: a path back. For anyone who wanted to make amends, Sophia included, there would be meaningful public opportunities to participate in work that honored the Foundation's mission. There would be volunteer placements helping to refurbish classrooms, funded therapy for family members willing to do the hard work of reckoning with their actions, and a process for demonstrating sustained behavioral change. Those offers were not tokens. They were invitations to rebuild trust through service. I remember the glint of chandeliers as I spoke, the way the lights carved small crescents on people's foreheads. I felt exposed and oddly at peace. I did not take glee in the board's decision. My victory, if one could call it that, was small, procedural, and rooted in responsibility. The funds were not for me to enjoy. They were a tool to preserve a teacher's dignity. In the days after the gala, the story spread. Channel 7 picked up the story, and within 48 hours, there were headlines. The Times ran a piece that was careful and descriptive rather than sensational. Social media did what social media does. It simplified nuance into a chorus of hot takes. Some people saw it as justice. Others called it family drama exploded by money. Donors who had given on the basis of image reconsidered quickly. Some withdrew support when they feared association with controversy, while others doubled down, telling us privately that the Foundation's mission was precisely why their funds mattered. The public reaction was a messy reflecting pool: judgment, curiosity, some applause, and several uncomfortable silences. Sophia's professional life heated in unexpected ways. A few of her clients, publicly accounting firms that relied on a pristine image for their own brand, distanced themselves. A marketing firm withdrew a retainer. Press conferences that had once lauded her work now asked pointed questions about privilege and propriety. I said nothing in public about their business repercussions. That wasn't my place. The consequences that came were the natural result of the board's process and how corporate clients evaluate risk. I had no interest in reveling in anyone's misfortune. Marcus's response was complicated. At first he seemed defensive, then uncertain, and then, perhaps because he saw the work the Foundation would actually do, he reached out privately. He expressed regret for not seeing how his presence could exacerbate the family's choices. It would be dishonest to say I felt an immediate warm glow at his outreach. I felt cautious hope. He offered to repurpose some of his team's skills toward the Foundation's communications and to help fund one of our refurbishment projects. Mrs. Stone, his mother, and a member of the board made an initial public statement about trusting the board's process. Small shifts like that, practical collaborations, are how broader change often starts. My parents, hard as it was for them, began therapy. That phrase, began therapy, sounded smaller in speech than the seismic rearrangement it represented behind closed doors. They were not stripped of love, they were asked to reckon. My mother called less defensively and more reflectively. My father, who had been a quiet man of few words, tried to bridge things awkwardly, bringing a casserole and sitting in silence while I graded homework at my kitchen table. Those moments felt like fragile stitches. I accepted their offers to attend a community volunteer orientation at one of our refurbished daycares, not as theatrical penance, but as a step toward learning how to be present in the ways the will intended. The Foundation launched programs that were, in the language of nonprofit budgets, both modest and immediate. We started with emergency stipends for teachers who faced housing insecurity, classroom grants for supplies and books, and a pilot program to fund overnight childcare for single parents working late shifts. Programs that emerged from conversations I had had at school more than at the gala. The 3 properties Eleanor had owned were evaluated for possible use. One could be repurposed into affordable staff housing, another into a community arts space for after-school programs, and the third into administrative offices for local nonprofits. These weren't grand pronouncements. They were inventories and blueprints and conversations with teachers and community leaders. Some donors withdrew, others joined. The money moved outward in careful increments. We prioritized transparency. The board required that every grant be documented and accounted for in public reports. If Eleanor had built her foundation in secrecy, she had at least left a structure that required us to be accountable in plain sight. Sophia left the city a few months later. She moved to a coastal town where she took a smaller role at a regional marketing agency and, quietly, began work with a nonprofit that retrained displaced workers for community jobs. I didn't publicize this. Word reached me in pieces. An email from a mutual acquaintance, a photograph tagged on social media of Sophia painting a mural with neighborhood kids. Her first public attempts to volunteer with the foundation were clumsy. At our orientation, she stumbled over the logistics and apologized for her past behavior, sincere in the small way people can be when they start to understand consequences. We offered her a defined volunteer role on the mural refurbishment project. She accepted. She wasn't instantly redeemed. Redemption, as my grandmother knew, is a slow and visible work. Months passed that felt like the slow knitting of something new. Parents in therapy learned different language for shame. Sophia learned how small public kindnesses accumulate into a track record. Marcus shifted some of his network's capacity to help with publicity for teacher appreciation events, practical things, not press stunts. The board created a formal restorative path for family members, sustained community service, formal apologies in appropriate contexts, and documented behavioral change. It was an invitation with clear steps. It wasn't a magic eraser. I continued to teach. Some nights I kept lesson plans next to board meeting minutes, the two documents of my life folded together like a well-used map. Students still asked about glitter and turkeys. Mateo asked one morning out of the blue if I had a grown-up job and a secret job, because he had heard about me on the news. I laughed and told him that being an adult sometimes meant doing two important things at once, taking care of children and helping people who help the children. He nodded, satisfied. We named programs for my grandmother in ways that tried to honor the woman who had never wanted her name on a plaque. Eleanor's Classroom Fund, the Dignity Stipend, and Neighborhood Teachers Housing Initiative. We didn't plaster her name across billboards. Instead, we published reports and used the funds to buy books, build shelves, and keep lights on in classrooms that had once worked by candlelight. The Foundation's first grants were small and targeted. $25,000 here for a classroom set of books, $50,000 there for emergency housing stipends. And they were meant to be catalytic, seeding other funding and showing donors and community leaders how practical money could change a school day. People asked me if the money changed my life. It didn't, in the glittering way that alters magazines. It allowed us to do work I'd been dreaming about while grading worksheets in a tiny kitchen. It allowed a teacher I knew to keep her apartment when a landlord decided to raise rent unexpectedly. It meant that a preschool could replace its broken heater. Those were not headlines, but they were real shifts in people's daily dignity. The media narrative settled into something softer as well. After the initial storm, several outlets covered the substantive work the foundation had started. They profiled a nurse who received a stipend to pay for a night shift creche, a librarian who used foundation funds to keep an after-school program running through the winter. Those stories reached people who had been skeptical, people who saw that the governance structure, messy as it had been, was producing measurable outcomes. Sophia's professional life recovered, slowly and unevenly. Some clients never returned. Others came back after seeing her tangible work with community projects and hearing her speak in smaller, less glamorous contexts about the lessons she'd learned. It wasn't immediate salvation. It was steady labor. Marcus, too, recalibrated. He became one of the foundation's unexpected partners, offering logistical support for a refurbishment effort that needed a communications push. Those shifts were small acknowledgments that optics could be transformed into outcomes if people were willing to redirect energy. There were nights when I still felt the small, private stings of family wounds. I missed some of the old rituals in a way that's hard to explain. Thanksgiving's warmth isn't only a plate at a table. It's a history of smells and arguments and consolation that feels like belonging. But I no longer equated my belonging to being a prop that made others look good. That was a lesson I've lived out loud. Dignity is not contingent on someone else's approval. A year after Eleanor's recording played under the chandeliers, the foundation had funded hundreds of small interventions in schools across the city. Teachers who had once dipped into their own pockets for field trips had money dedicated for classes. One of Eleanor's houses had become a small, affordable unit for teachers on probationary contracts. Another had been converted into a community art space where children could paint and experiment without being judged for messy work. Donors who stayed saw that the foundation's stewardship was deliberate and transparent. The board, now more practiced at governance, had established regular audits and community oversight. The family, our family, did not become a Hallmark special. We were real people with scars, and those scars required consistent patience. My parents attended counseling. There were months when they regressed and months when they reached forward and listened in new ways. My mother called more often, but the calls changed tone. She asked about a student's home life and not about who would be photographed at the next event. My father took a volunteer shift at the community garden attached to one of the property refurbishments and returned home mucky and oddly proud. Those small acts were not theater. They were work. Sophia continued with the foundation's restorative path. Her social media later included photos of her sanding benches, of her holding lists of supplies for classrooms. She wrote one public note that was honest and short. "I've been learning that being part of a family and a community means repair, not performance." People criticized and praised. Most of the time she showed up rather than announced. For me, the best moments were the unpublicized ones. The first box of new stickers for a classroom that had never had extras. A teacher's voice crack when she told me the stipend meant her commuter child's after-school months wouldn't be cut. A shy parent who came to an event and left with a small set of books for their children. Those were the measures of what was actually changing. Wealth redirected with intention is a different kind of engine than applause. It hums quietly and keeps things moving. People sometimes asked, did I feel empowered by having a voice in the foundation? Yes, but it wasn't about power the way people imagine it on television. It was about responsibility. Deciding which schools got kits, which neighborhoods needed daycares, how to make an estate that had once been secret work transparently for good. Being chair of the board was a job that required tough conversations, fiscal prudence, and an insistence on humility. I made mistakes. I listened more than I spoke. I insisted that every dollar be used in ways that respected Eleanor's intention. Dignity for teachers and essential workers, not as a means to rewrite family narratives. There were difficult conversations, too. Some board members wanted more aggressive PR to dispel the scandal and move on. I pushed back, insisting that our first duty was to make sure the programs were sound, that we measured outcomes, that we listened to teachers and didn't parachute projects in without their buy-in. That insistence sometimes strained relationships with donors used to quick wins. But it created a culture where school principals felt invited to shape grants, where a teacher could tell us frankly what a classroom needed without fear of being dismissed. One crisp Thursday morning, a teacher I had once mentored, her name was Rosa, sent me a photo of her students reading in a corner they'd furnished with new cushions and books purchased with a foundation grant. They looked up at the camera like small planets lined up, earnest and curious. Rosa wrote, "They love it. They keep asking for story after story. Thank you." That message sat on my phone for days. It was evidence of something solid, not performative. When people who had excluded me in the past asked if I held grudges, I said that I held boundaries. Boundaries are love-shaped into policy sometimes. The foundation had policies too, policies that required transparency, policies that asked for accountability when the people entrusted with resources used exclusion as a tool. Policies are not revenge, they are structures for justice. Years later, when Thanksgiving came around, the invitation came quietly. My parents had, with slow and honest work, rebuilt the idea of family into a version that could include accountability. The table was smaller than it had been in my childhood, but it felt more real. Sophia carved a turkey in a way that was not performative. She shared a memory of Eleanor that made her voice soft and true. We didn't pretend overnight that everything was fixed. We talked about what we'd learned, about how privilege sometimes looks like generosity, and how generosity without humility can harm. Those conversations were heavy and necessary. What I carried forward from Eleanor's test, and what I hope people see in this, is that inheritance is not simply money or property. It is a responsibility. It is a call to lift the dignity of those whose work is quiet and foundational. It is a reminder that the way we treat another person when no one is watching is the truest ledger of character. Eleanor trusted me with a difficult thing, not simply to manage assets, but to make their allocation honor people who sustain our everyday lives. I tried imperfectly to meet that trust. If you took anything from this story, please share it. Tell me in the comments about a time your dignity was challenged, or when you saw someone choose compassion over appearance. If you have been excluded, know that exclusion can be a bitter teacher, but also an invitation to claim your worth beyond what others decide. Dignity is not conferred only at a gilded table. I still teach kindergarten. I still fall asleep grading lesson plans on a lumpy couch. But now, when a child brings me a crayon drawing of a sun, I see not only a bright picture, but a small sign that something bigger is possible when we choose to invest in the people who teach those children. The foundation carries on with careful stewardship. It is not perfect and never will be, because any human institution reflects human flaws, but it is oriented toward care. Grandma Eleanor believed in tests. I believe she believed in people passing them. We all failed and learned in public that year. Some of us learned faster, others took longer. Dignity, though, once affirmed, creates a ripple. Teachers got supplies they hadn't had. A daycare kept its doors open, and a small house became a home for a young educator. Those are not the dramatic strokes of a headline. They are steady strokes on a daily canvas. If this story spoke to you, subscribe to hear more true-life stories about people doing hard, ordinary work with honest consequences. Share this with someone who needs to hear that dignity can be defended without becoming a show, and that inheritance can mean responsibility as much as reward. My parents and I are still learning. Sophia and I speak sometimes. About projects, about the kids she sees now in murals, and about the awkwardness of apology that asks for nothing in return. Marcus helps when he can. The foundation keeps its books open and its focus narrow. And I, who once thought my life would be measured in crayons and small gratitude, now try to steward a gift that has to do more than change a family portrait. It has to change a classroom, a life, a neighborhood. If there is a final thing I can say, it is this. Being excluded from a table can hurt, but sometimes it asks you to find where you truly belong. For me, that belonging has been work, quiet, public, and ongoing, helping the people who steady our world. That, to me, is a worthy inheritance.